Chapter 1. Cecilia Frobisher. Cecilia Frobisher looked up at the row of terraced Georgian mansions that lined the street. It was growing darker, being just before 10:30 p.m., and the breeze was rustling the leaves on the sycamore trees that lined the street. 6, 8, 10, she counted, as she scanned the house numbers along the row. 14. Hang on, where's 12? She briefly scanned back to where 12 should have been. She dug back in her bag for her appointment letter, and read the paragraph that detailed the address. She read, "Please arrive at 12 Grimmauld Place, London, on 15th July, at 10:30 p.m. Well, here she was. This street was Grimmauld Place. And it was 10:30 now. She turned back, still holding the letter. If this is Nick Smith, playing a practical joke on me, I will kill him, though Cecilia, in frustration. She scanned the numbers and this time, in an old-fashioned script read, number 12. Blinking in the failing evening light, she approached the steps. That's funny, she thought, must have been a trick of the light. She hauled her bag onto her shoulder and said, well, here we are then, and rang the bell. 88,888,888. Cecilia had seen the advertisement for a research scientist in the back of a periodical in the local library. Exciting new prospects, read the ad, work as part of a team with rewarding results. Help towards saving the world, had caught her eye. The advert did not go into details, but she cut it out anyway. The job would be in London. Maybe it was what she needed after her last disastrous career move. And after Tim. She phoned Libby that afternoon. You have not got to keep blaming yourself. Your job went pear-shaped after you lost your husband. Which was my fault, sighed Cecilia. He died, Shicky. It was not your fault. You had separated, gone your own different ways. I know, it all sounds logical, but when I sit down and think, I'll be moving to London with this job, I'll be selling the house, our house. You sound like you are giving up, heavens above How long have I known you for? You're 28, you still have a life to lead. I feel old, Libs, I feel like there's nothing left for me. Libby sighed. She had been there for Cecilia when she and Timothy separated. That had been 2 years ago, but she doubted her friend had ever stopped loving him. His death had been a blow to her, and her work had gone downhill. The school where Cecilia taught had given her sick leave, but she had never gone back. Well, you know what I think, and deep down I think you know too. 88,888,888. The door opened. A man, taller than herself and an expression of stone, looked at her. Yes? Hello, I'm Cecilia Frobisher. I am here to meet, but she was cut off mid-sentence. Yes, dear. Come in, come in. Mr. White is expecting you. Let me take your bag, dear. She shouldered past the tall man and ushered her inside. Oh, how impolite of me. Cecilia, do you mind me calling you that? I am Mrs. Weasley. Before we get into that, intoned the man who had answered the door, perhaps I should escort Mrs. Frobisher? Mr. White will want to talk to her immediately. Yes, of course, Severus, said the woman who had introduced herself as Mrs. Weasley. The door was closed behind her and she followed them into the house. It seemed a cold place, quite colourless and dim. The man whom Mrs. Weasley had addressed as Severus led her quickly across the room to a room underneath the stairs, where a bright light shone through the frosted window. Mr. White was stenciled on the door. The man called Severus knocked. 88,888,888. She had met Mr. White before, at the interview. It had been curious to say the least, as she had been told to bring nothing with her, no references, certificates of any kind, nothing. The interview had been held at an office building, and had consisted of simply confirming what she had said in her letter. Thinking back, there had been many odd things about the interview. "I understand your husband is dead," Mr. White had said. "Pneumonia, last November." "That's right, but how did you—" began Cecilia. "There are many things that cannot be explained by science," said Mr. White, smoothing down the lapel on his pinstripe suit. It did not go with the blue and purple polka dot tie. But sometimes one has to find the direction to use a gift. One should not dismiss that it was never there. He was quite right. She had begun to doubt that she had been wasting her time all these years. Except for teaching science, she had not made a successful career in it, and she was now even doubting her talents as a teacher. "Mr. White, what will this work involve?" "You will be working with one of our own researchers. We are attempting to make many medicines that will help in times of war to counteract the effects of attacks on the civilians of Great Britain and indeed those of the world. With what you may help to develop, many lives will be saved." There, he had her. Helping someone else was just what she needed to do to forget about her own troubles. "But you don't know anything about me." Cecilia rose from her chair. "Don't get me wrong, but how do you know I will be the right person for the job?" Mr. White arched his fingers. "If you accept this position, Mrs. Frobisher, you may leave it at any time. If you accept, I will send you confirmation of your appointment to your home address and we will meet further discuss what we wish you to do." 88,888,888. The whispering got louder, as they approached the door. "Ah, Severus, I see you have brought our newest employee to see me." Mr. White was smiling at her, but what struck her first was the clothes. He seemed to be dressed in a long robe. And a pointy cap. He certainly didn't have a beard at the interview. "Yes, Professor. Although if it had been up to Molly Weasley, she would have been made tea and fussed over first." "Professor?" thought Cecilia, now totally confused. "Dear Molly," he sighed. "Now, Mrs. Frobisher, or may I call you Cecilia?" The professor stepped back into the room, gesturing to a chair. "Yes, of course," replied Cecilia, sitting. It was then occurred to her that she may not entirely be sure what she had let herself in for. "I think there are few things I need to explain before we continue. You may remember at interview I said that for you to agree to the work was enough. That is because you have accepted work in the wizarding community." Chapter 2, The Assignment. "I am sorry, Mrs. Frobisher," continued the professor, "I have not been entirely honest with you. As of this morning I am sure, you believed that anything magical and supernatural to be myth, legend, fable." She nodded, unsure where this was going. The professor closed the door of the small office and started to pace towards the high bookshelves, at the far end of the room. "I am about to be frank about ourselves, that is to say, the wizarding community and ourselves here at Grimmauld Place. If there is any time you wish to leave, you may do so. We cannot stop you and I thank you for coming, but I would ask that you would listen to what I have to say. Please, ask anything you wish, Cecilia, as I proceed. My name is Albus Dumbledore, and I am a wizard. You are at the headquarters of an order which consists of wizards fighting to prevent the rise of evil magic. The magic of which I speak threatens all, not only wizards, but muggles, and may, if we cannot prevent it, engulf the whole world." "Magic?" asked Cecilia, confused. "What do you mean, magic? There's no such th." She was silenced as a row of books neatly removed themselves from the second from of the bookshelf, and replaced themselves one by one. "I am sure you are having trouble absorbing this information," smiled Dumbledore, patting Cecilia on the shoulder, and continued. "The power behind the evil magic is based on fear of muggles, non-magical people like yourself, Cecilia. We need to find other ways to fight, and we have to look at all fronts. Our community, our world, the magical world in which we live and conceal from muggles has been kept hidden for centuries, millennia. Our actions are passed down to you through legends and fairy tales, and because of this, a certain, shall we say, arrogance, has crept into thinking that moles collectively do not possess the attributes that we prize in ourselves: courage, bravery, wit, intellect, for example. This is the root of the dark evil that has arisen. Do you understand me so far, Cecilia? She nodded, waiting for Dumbledore to continue. He glanced at her, and paced back again, with his hands closed behind him. The dark magic that we are endeavoring to fight, however, has its roots in what all wizards believe to greater or lesser extents, that we are better than moles. We, including myself, I hasten to add, believe because we can do magic, which performs tasks that moles have to invent things for, that those things that you use, electricity, isn't it? Mechanics, medicine, are worthless to us. So if you don't need them, why do you need me? Cecilia was having a hard time taking in all this. I have to admit to a certain amount of disregard to the ways of moles, but it is not a mistake that I admit to lightly. When I realized what the potential of the knowledge and skill you as a people have, I've done everything I can to introduce it to our practices, resulting in the reason you are sitting here. In short, we need the help of moles if we are to overcome the dark evil which has arisen. Dumbledore sat down, facing her. So, what you are saying is that there are more like me. More moles, that is? We were given the names of people, moles that is, who have the skills we need and who are not working. We have a few dozen, scientists. Yes, scientists working for us already, from many different branches. Those that deal with engineering, electricity, mechanics. We wish you to work, however, from our headquarters, with another professor. Magical people? Thought Cecilia, want me to work with them? Her head was spinning. This was not what she was expecting. I can understand this is a lot to take in, and you are welcome to think it over. We have arranged a room for you here, at the headquarters. Then you may have some time to get organized. What is it precisely you want me to do? Just then, the door was tapped, and opened. Do you wish me to join you now, Professor? It was the tall man, Severus, who had answered the door. Yes. Cecilia, this is Professor Severus Snape. He, like myself and many of the Order, work at Britain's wizard school Hogwarts. Professor Snape teaches potions at the school, and it is with him I wish you to work, and it is your skills both as a scientist and a teacher that you will need. You will be teaching Professor Snape what you know, and the knowledge he gains you will use together to develop new potions. Cecilia rose from her chair and extended her hand. Pleased to meet you, Professor Snape. And yourself, madam. You may call me Severus, he said, extending his hand, though there was no warmth in the gesture. Fine, fine, smiled Dumbledore, brightly. Severus, will you show Mrs. Frobisher to the kitchen? I am sure Molly will have something made for supper. Cecilia, Dumbledore continued, we will meet tomorrow for you to give us your final word on whether you will be working with us. Good night. Chapter 3, The Order. The chattering became louder as Severus Snape showed Cecilia to the kitchen. Mrs. Frobisher, smiled Mrs. Weasley, taking her hand. I expect you'll be wanting some supper, dear. Will sandwiches be okay? She led Cecilia to a chair, whilst she continued. Cecilia looked around her. A flat-bladed knife was buttering a huge pile of bread slices, the water was running from the tap and the lettuce was washing itself. These are some other members of the Order. Mrs. Weasley gestured to the other side of the table, where 3 other wizards were sitting. The chattering stopped, and they stared at her. Mrs. Weasley glanced back towards Cecilia. This must be strange to you. It's hard enough when Muggle-born children are sent their letters for Hogwarts, but they have time to adapt. I'm Molly, she finished. Cecilia, said Cecilia. What is Hogwarts? Britain's school for wizards and witches, to train them in magic. That's no doubt where you'll be working with Professor Snape. Bill, tell Mrs. Frobisher about Hogwarts. Mrs. Weasley gestured to the table. One of the wizards from the other side of the table stood up and moved to a chair next to Cecilia. Bill, he said, sticking out a hand. His bright red hair was slicked to one side. What Mum forgot to mention is that Hogwarts is the best school of magic in the whole world. We learn about charms, potions, the history of magic, even muggle studies. He laughed. Cecilia frowned. Muggle studies? That didn't sound very flattering, more like a curiosity, and she remembered what Dumbledore has said about the arrogance of wizards towards muggles. What did you learn at school, Mrs. Frobisher? Said a pink-haired witch, from across the table. I wanted to take a year out from Hogwarts to go to a muggle school and find out for myself, but my mum wouldn't have it. In muggle schools it's maths and you learn about your history, and English, and you liked electricity, and potions, and mechanics, isn't that right? Interrupted Bill. Yes, but it is much more complicated than that, smiled Cecilia, determined to give as good as she got. We don't have magic to help us with everyday tasks. We have to learn how to do everything ourselves. There. But sometimes it is just the joy of knowledge which is satisfying. That's how I feel about science. You sound like Hermione Granger. A third wizard sitting next to the pink-haired witch said. He had light brown hair, and twinkly eyes. I've never taught another student like her. She is intrinsically interested in everything she does. She does it for the love of the work itself, not just because she has to get through it. Bill and the pink-haired witch nodded in agreement. So you are a teacher as well? Asked Cecilia, as Mrs. Weasley laid out salad and sandwiches on the table. I was a teacher, a professor at Hogwarts, 2 years ago. My name's Lupin, Remus Lupin. And this is Tonks, he said, gesturing to the pink-haired witch. He gestured towards the table, as Mrs. Weasley set down a pot of tea. Tea? Asked Mrs. Weasley. That would be lovely, said Cecilia. Turning to Remus Lupin, she asked, You don't work there anymore, Mr. Lupin? Lupin exchanged glances with Tonks. Alas, no, not anymore. I used to teach defense against the dark arts, but Professor Dumbledore needed my particular skills for the order. Then he added, Please call me Remus. I used to teach, said Cecilia, helping herself to a sandwich. Science. They looked at her curiously. Understanding the physical world around us. Using that knowledge to devise ways to improve our lives. Some people, even in our world, think science is some kind of magic. What's defense against the dark arts? And so it continued. They chatted on into the night, eating sandwiches and exchanging pleasantries. Cecilia began to relax. In the context of coming to terms with magic and wizards, she set this to the back of her mind, and found she could talk easily with them. The fourth wizard at the table, she found out, was Nicholas Diggle, who worked for the Ministry of Magic. She was shown upstairs, when she was beginning to be exhausted, by Remus. Mrs. Weasley had already sent her bags upstairs, and she had been warned of a picture that would probably scream at her when she passed it, and, right on cue as they waked past it, it yelled. I can see you, you wretched mull. And you, consorting with mulls. Traitors, the lot of you in my house. Don't worry about that, said Remus, it is the portrait of the present owner's mum, and we can't seem to remove it from the wall. He opened the door to her room and gestured inside. Everything you need should be in here, the bathroom is down the hall. Thank you, smiled Cecilia, following him. It had been a long day. Is there anything else you need, Mrs. Frobisher? Cecilia, said Cecilia. No, I don't think so. Good night, then Cecilia, said Remus, smiling at her. Good night, said Cecilia, as he closed the door. Then she sat on the bed, and ran through everything that had happened that day. She doubted that she had ever had a stranger one. She wanted to stay awake and decide if this is what she wanted to do, but sleep overcame her, so she got into bed, still fully clothed, and slept. She didn't hear, an hour later, the padding of paws outside the door. Chapter 4, Adjusting. A warm summer glow irradiated the room. It gently roused Cecilia from a peaceful slumber. The sunlight was warm on her face, and she pushed the covers off her. Funny, she thought, why am I asleep in my clothes? Then the events of the last evening hit her. She sat on the edge of the bed, considering all that had gone on. Magic, the job, these people, this house. She mused. It seemed perfectly plausible that magic could exist. However, this clashed with a great deal of common sense. She glanced down at her watch. 6:30. Gosh, she hadn't even slept for 5 hours. She crossed the small room to her bag. It was on a chair, the only other furniture in the room being a dressing table and small wardrobe, apart from the bed. A shower would be good, she thought, and decided to explore down the corridor where Remus Lupin had mentioned the bathroom was, with her towel and shampoo. She found the bathroom and, making sure there was no one around, locked the door. There was an old-fashioned iron bath in the room, with Victorian-style taps, set lengthways across, so that it filled the room. Oh well, a bath it is, she mused, wondering when the last time she had one. She started to run the water and added some shampoo to the water, to make do for bubbly bath. "There's some soap over there on the sink," said the woman in the picture, by the window, making Cecilia jump. Carefully, she removed the picture from its hook, and placed it face to the wall, ignoring the inevitable rebukes. "That's one thing I don't think I'll get used to," she thought, realizing she must give her answer to Professor Dumbledore that morning. She turned off the bath tap, anticipating the satisfaction of being clean. Once she was in, it felt delicious. She sank into it, and analyzed the job proposal. Pros, she thought, while she massaged her feet. She would be doing a job, and that was better than sitting round at home feeling sorry for herself. Any more pros, she wondered. Well, the people she met last night did seem very nice. And Mum would have approved of the tea. Wetting her hair in the water, and rubbing in the shampoo, she thought about the reasons not to take it. What on earth would she say to Libby? And her family, for that matter? She didn't know these people that well, who might do heaven knows what in their spare time. Magic, indeed. As she rinsed the bubbles out of her hair, she chided herself. You have been made to feel welcome here, given a bed and food, yet you haven't even given them your answer. For all they know, you might just say no thanks and leave. She drained the water from the bath and thought about Timothy. Darling Tim. Her husband. Libby was right, she knew. She herself, Cecilia Wells, still loved Timothy Frobisher, and probably always would. If only we hadn't separated, she sighed, inwardly. Perhaps he might still be alive. Perhaps he wouldn't have had one of his mad ideas to climb Scawfell Pike in the middle of winter on his own. Just then, there was a knock on the bathroom door. Cecilia, is that you in there? She recognized the voice as the pink-haired witch from last night, Tunks. Yes, replied Cecilia, as she proceeded to get dry. I checked your room, to see if you were all right, and you weren't there. Molly wondered whether you wanted eggs on toast for breakfast. That sounds lovely, said Cecilia, I'll be down in a tick. Righto, said Tunks and walked away. Cecilia considered her reflection in the full-length mirror on the back of the door. She had never been a beauty. There was possibly only one feature she liked about herself, apart from her ears, was her hair, mainly because she had so few bad hair days, though strawberry blonde was not a flattering color. Other than that, she had to admit that she quite plain. Even Libby had admonished her for turning into a dowdy old woman, and the weight she had gained. It was only about a stone, but it had not helped matters. "You know," said her reflection, "getting yourself off to Marks and Spencer for some new underwear would be a start." 88,888,888. What in heaven's name is Dumbledore playing at? Cecilia heard a man's voice echoing downstairs. Having discarded her interview clothes, she had found some suitable trousers and a plain blue jumper and was making her way downstairs. She heard some other voices, too indistinct to make out what was being said. "All right," she heard, as she approached the kitchen. "Snape. Working with Snape. I wouldn't trust a muggle-born witch or wizard within 100 feet of him, not least a muggle." She paused, listening intently. A few more whispers, and a raised voice, a woman's voice this time. Into the order. Then she heard Molly Weasley, "I know this is your house, dear, but really, did you not hear what Albus told us all? And from what we saw of her last night, she did seem rather bright." "For a mole," she heard the first man finish. "Of all the cheek." "Keep your voice down, please," she heard Mrs. Weasley whisper urgently. The volume of the conversation dropped again. Then she heard someone walking out of the kitchen, and pressed herself back against the wall of the staircase. "Ow!" went one of the pictures. "Sorry," she whispered back absently, thinking about the conversation she had just overheard. "These people, wizards, really don't know anything about us," she smiled to herself, and at that moment, Tonks appeared at the kitchen door, her hair styled into a lime green bob. "Cecilia. I thought I heard someone on the stairs. Come through. Molly has done a lovely breakfast." Tonks beckoned her towards the kitchen, where a smell of warm toast and tea emanated. "Are poached eggs okay with you?" asked Mrs. Weasley. "Take a seat, dear. Did you sleep well?" "Very well, thank you," she said politely. Then she jumped as she heard a crack sound, in the living room. "What on earth was?" she began, only to see Dumbledore standing where the sound had come from, with smoke dispersing around him. She turned and looked questioningly at Tonks, who giggled. He was dressed in a long red robe, and matching hat, quite regal if Cecilia had to describe it. This is what a wizard should look like, she thought, and the full weight of the employment proposal eased itself onto her mind. "Cup of tea, Albus?" asked Mrs. Weasley. "That would be lovely, Molly," he replied, and turned to address Cecilia. "I trust you slept well, Cecilia. I'll just let you finish your breakfast, then we can discuss your working with us." He took his tea out into the living room, and Tonks said, "Was it okay? The room, I mean." "Yes, absolutely fine," said Cecilia, "but the picture in the bathroom didn't half give me a fright." Tonks smiled. "I noticed you'd taken it down. Listen, I don't know how this must be for you, strange, I suppose." Cecilia glanced at the broom that was idly sweeping around Mrs. Weasley and nodded. "I know I shouldn't ask," she continued, sipping at her tea, "but have you made a decision whether you'll be working for Dumbledore?" Cecilia smiled back at her, knowingly. 88,888,888. "Have you considered the proposal I put to you last night?" Dumbledore had joined Cecilia in the kitchen after breakfast was finished. Tonks and Mrs. Weasley had made themselves scarce. "I have thought long and hard," replied Cecilia. She pressed on. "On the face of your proposal it seems ludicrous. All of this," she gestured around the kitchen, "logically shouldn't exist. It seems improbable." "But?" asked Dumbledore, getting up from his chair and began to pace. "It doesn't feel impossible, it feels like." She paused and tried to describe what she felt. What she really felt was apprehensive, and that she should leave there and then. But that would be ignoring this faint whispering in her head telling her, insisting, that she would regret forever not finding out. He stopped pacing as Cecilia looked firmly at him. "I feel, Professor, there is yet more science to uncover, when I was perhaps giving up help of a purpose." She sighed, feeling quite unnerved at being so honest with someone she hardly knew, but continued. "I liked teaching, Professor, more than you would probably know. After Timothy, my husband's death, it all went wrong. I didn't feel as if I could do this anymore. It seems like I am being given an opportunity that would give me a purpose, and it would be a mistake to leave, whatever my misgivings." Dumbledore continued to look back at Cecilia, and she wondered whether she had spoken too frankly. He sat down. "It is hard to bear the loss of a loved one, particularly when you blame yourself for the loss. But how did you dash? What is the old proverb, time heals all wounds? In my experience, this is rarely true. The pain is just diluted over a longer period." He smiled, kindly, and their eyes met, in mutual acknowledgement. Cecilia broke the silence. "What of the practicalities? I assume I can't tell anyone what type of work I will be undertaking. What about my family? My sister is living in my house, and I'll need to tell them something. I would ask you to keep the nature of this work to yourself. However, there are safeguards in place so that should you ever disclose where you are and whom you are with to any non-magical people, the conversation will be forgotten. You will also forget everything connected with the Order. In that case, I will say I'm working for the Patent Office in London, and that I can't disclose my whereabouts, or what I am doing." Dumbledore nodded. "Just one more question, Professor, before I give you my answer. Why did you choose me to work with you? I noticed that you didn't answer me last night." "You are indeed bright," said Dumbledore, making Cecilia think about the conversation she had heard earlier. "This dark magic which we are all fighting is known about by your Prime Minister. He has volunteered information about people who are not working currently in Britain. We chose to, shall we say, assess muggles we thought were suitable, but with your teaching background and your lack of ties in the muggle community, you seemed a likely candidate. From your testimony only a moment ago, this appointment appears to be mutually beneficial." His eyes twinkled, but said no more. Cecilia exhaled, her final self-imposed obstacle removed. "From what I understand, Mrs. Frobisher, you are accepting the employment proposition I have put to you." "I think under the bizarre circumstances that I find myself in, Professor, I do." Chapter 5 Revelations. Dumbledore rose, and extended his hand, Muggle style. "We have a deal then, Cecilia," he smiled. "There is one favor I need to ask. I have to get things sorted out back in the real world, back home. Get some books, and equipment together, things we will need for experiments, see my family and let them know that I won't be able to see them for some time. Give me time to sort this all out in my head," she thought. "I had already allowed time for you to do this, but only for 2 days. Will this be sufficient time?" "Definitely," replied Cecilia, relieved at being able to see her family and giving herself some breathing space. She rose, and made to shake Dumbledore's hand. "There is one other thing. I wish for Professor Snape to collect you in order to start work immediately afterwards. He will be discreet, I can assure you of that, and you will be in safe hands. As you yourself know, he is a member of the Order." "Thank you, Professor," replied Cecilia, thinking about what she had overheard the owner of the house say about leaving her with Snape this morning. "It is settled then," smiled Dumbledore. They shook on it. 88,888,888. Later that morning Mrs. Weasley asked Cecilia to help her with some cleaning. She embarrassed herself by asking where the dusters and polish were, and followed Mrs. Weasley to the first floor, serenaded by the portrait from hell screaming obscenities about moles and mudbloods. Molly explained to Cecilia that she was cleaning out 3 rooms for her children and 2 of their friends who would be coming on Sunday and staying for the summer. How many children do you have, Molly? Asked Cecilia curiously as she watched Mrs. Weasley use her wand to eradicate the cobwebs. Arthur and I have 7, she replied, proudly, 6 boys and a girl. My eldest 3, Bill, Charlie who you met yesterday, and Percy are all working now. There's just my twins and Ron and Ginny still at Hogwarts. I expect you'll meet them, soon. There, she said, scrutinizing the room. Can you grab the rugs, and roll them up for me? Cecilia complied, and almost choked as a swarm of, well they looked like bees with faces, encircled her. Bumblenorks, said Mrs. Weasley, casting another charm. They won't harm you. She added, seeing the look of fright on Cecilia's face. Do you have any family, dear? There's just me at home, said Cecilia, as she moved to the other side of the room. My sister Amy lives at home with Mum, but she's going to live at my house while I'm here, she replied, remembering the puttings off she and Tim had agreed to. Well, that she has argued about and he had given up challenging. At the end, just one more year, when we have enough money, when I get my promotion, we should just wait till I'm a teacher because the maternity deal is much better. She sighed inwardly, and turned to Mrs. Weasley. What next? It took them over an hour to clean all 3 rooms. The sight of Mrs. Weasley casting charms and spells to eradicate, clean, scrub and tidy never waning in interest to her. Just then, they were finishing off the final room. Remus Lupin popped his head round the door. Having fun? He chuckled, as Mrs. Weasley finished off blitzing the curtains. Superb, replied Cecilia, grinning at him. I just wondered whether I could borrow Cecilian now, Molly, if you've finished with her. Yes, of course, Remus. I set some soup to do downstairs on timer. When Percy's head gets to the 12th position, it's done, replied Mrs. Weasley, as Cecilia headed towards the door. I've got something for you, said Remus, as they headed back down the stairs to the living room. On the table was a large brown book with yellowing pages, which Cecilia could only describe in her mind as Grimo-Irish. He sat down and Cecilia sat next to him. He opened the cover, revealing an illustration of what looked to be a picture of children, skipping through a meadow, with some woods in the background, and the words Mysterious Mythology. This used to belong to my parents, explained Remus, as she perused the cover. They never looked at it much, only when my brother and I were young. He watched her reading the words that encircled the title page, energy, magic, light, running end to end around the illustration. He flicked over a few pages, pausing briefly over an illustration of a basket containing balls, smiling slightly. Cecilia looked at the page Remus turned to next. My favorite was always Grimelda, he smiled, shuffling to the page. She always looked so beautiful in her ball gown. I used to make my mum read it over and over, until I was asleep. These are like our fairy tales, said Cecilia, smiling as if remembering a long-forgotten time. Have you heard of them? Snow White and the 7 Dwarfs? Rumpelstiltskin? Jack and the Beanstalk? She animated the beanstalk by extending her arm into the air. There's nothing like a good fantasy story to make you feel fluffy and four again. She leaned further into the book to look at the picture, and a glimmer of an arrow, pointing the way to comprehension, appeared in Cecilia's mind. She looked up at Remus. Perhaps wizards and moles weren't so different after all. I'd like you to have it, to read, Remus said, exhaling briefly as her gesticulating hand came to rest on his. Oh no, I couldn't possibly. She began. I insist. If nothing else, it may give you some background on the way wizards think of moles, and other ... things. A long-term loan then? I really couldn't keep it. He placed the book carefully in her lap. She turned a few pages over from Grimelda, to the pages in the book that were separated by the book's ribbon marker. You know, I really think you're remarkable, if you don't mind me saying. continued Remus, as he sat back in the sofa. "I can't think of many muggles willing to adapt to such new ideas." "How many muggles do you know?" asked Cecilia, examining an illustration that had caught her eye. "Not many," he conceded, "although many of the witches and wizards that attend Hogwarts were muggle-born. Their parents were not magical, and they were brought up in ordinary schools, just like muggle children. Some wizards, though, they see muggle-borns as different. It is amazing how intolerant some of them, sometimes." "You're telling me," Cecilia thought, as she turned from the book. "You're not a wizard yourself?" she asked. "Why do you say that?" "You referred to the wizards as they, not us." "Slip of the tongue," he replied, hoping that his reply didn't sound too guarded. "Anyway, there's nothing remarkable about me," she continued. "I know I've accepted employment here, but there's still a little part of me wondering what in heaven's name I'm doing. I mean, I don't even know what I'm doing, and Professor Snape, well, he doesn't exactly seem like the friendliest of people." "Well, to be honest, he does scare the living daylights out of the students," laughed Remus. "However, Dumbledore trusts him." "But you don't?" questioned Cecilia. "I'm sorry," she said, when his expression turned somber. "You don't have to answer that. Severus Snape is nothing if not dedicated to the subject of potions. I'm sure that you'll be able to form a satisfactory professional relationship." Remus turned to face her. "We were at school together. I'm not the best person to ask for a character reference though." She looked at him for qualification, as Molly called lunch. Remus chuckled. "Let's just say we weren't the very best of friends." 88,888,888. There were quite a few people in the kitchen, and Cecilia wondered how they were all going to fit round the table. She needn't have worried. The table seemed to have grown to accommodate them and, looked round, Cecilia recognized Tunks and Bill from the night before. "Can I give you a hand, Molly?" she asked. "No thanks, dear, it's nearly all done," replied Mrs. Weasley, as the French stick cut itself into small chunks and proceeded to be buttered. "Cecilia," called Tunks, as Cecilia and Remus crossed the kitchen. "Bill and I were just saying how well you are taking it. We'd like you to meet some other members of the Order." She motioned to the group of wizards next to them. "Sturgis Podmore," said a tall wizard. "I am sure I can speak for everyone when I say what a pleasure to meet you. So, you've come to help us out with Severus Snape's little problem?" Tunks giggled, hiding her face behind her hand. "I'm going to be working with him, yes," replied Cecilia, smiling. "But I must say, I am not sure how we'll get on. He does seem very forbidding," finished the witch next to Bill, Bathsheba. They all laughed. "Indeed," came a voice behind them. No one had heard Snape enter the kitchen, and their smiles withered as he glanced at each of them. He then turned to Cecilia. "Mrs. Frobisher, after lunch I would be grateful if you would remain in the kitchen. Professor Dumbledore is eager we start to get to know one another." He paused, analyzing the stony faces of the others for any hint of amusement, then sat down on the far side of the table. "You must have got on the right side of him," whispered a second wizard, who looked very much like Bill, but with long red hair and an earring. "Why's that?" "Because he didn't insult you." They chatted over lunch, and she found out that the long-haired wizard was in fact Mrs. Weasley's second eldest son, Charlie. The others, Betty Griffin, Bathsheba Bradley and Benjamin Wergs, all worked as ARAs for the Ministry of Magic. "It's a bit like your police force," explained Benjamin, tapping his bowl with his wand for the third time, as it filled with Mrs. Weasley's soup. "We prevent the misuse of magic, as directed by our magical decrees." "So if your ministry employs you as the police," said Cecilia, "why do you need the Order?" There was a pause. Everyone stopped what they were doing and exchanged glances. Snape looked over at Benjamin. Dumbledore explained to you the nature of your work, Cecilia? Remus questioned, breaking the silence. Wizards exist in our world, the magical world that is, whose actions and deeds are done purely in the pursuit of power. He looked at Snape and continued. To get the power that they seek, the dominance and tyranny over people, they have carried out many terrible acts, not only towards wizards, but also to non-magical people, muggles. So great is the power the worst dark wizard alive today has amassed, it is beyond the control of others in their official capacity to prevent it. That's if the ministry would actually get its head out of its own backside and realize what was going on, interrupted Charlie cynically. Mrs. Weasley gave him a look. Hence the formation of the Order of the Phoenix, continued Benjamin. Combined forces. A Gestalt entity. Eh? Said Tonks, mopping up the last of her soup with some bread. The net result when we all work together in the Order, explained Bertie, is greater than the results if we acted individually. Oh, she replied. Nothing important, then.